We are hoping to be joined by one of the other essayists this morning, but I'd like to start by introducing Nicholas Hartleb, who authored one of the essays with Robin Carlson, Sausen Arafay, one of our essayists, and Ken Zeigler. And we're hoping Joyce King will be able to join us. This is an experiment, and as with all empirical endeavors, one never knows how it's going to work out. But we are excited about two things. One, that you are here. Two, that you've read every single one of the essays that are posted on the website. So go ahead and get your notes out. All of those careful documentations, your marginalia. What we want to do this morning, and we will do this again tomorrow morning and on Monday with some of the other essayists, is to engage in a conversation, a dialogue. Our colleagues have had some things to say. They have said them. They've posted them. I believe they all still stand behind them. They do. And so we would like to begin a conversation about this theme, non sate skire. To know is not enough. And just as a quick reminder, the point of the theme this year is to point us back to the mission of AERA. And to say, the first part of that mission, we've done pretty well. But let's challenge ourselves to do the second part of the mission a little better, so that we begin to focus more on the use of research to improve education and to serve the public good. What I'd like to do is to ask a few of you to comment on the theme. I'd like to engage the audience and then engage our essayists in response. So I'd like a couple of thoughts about what connotation of non-sate skire you bring to this session. Who's willing? Anyone? Anyone?
There's someone right here.
Let me go back here and I'll be right back. Yes, please introduce yourself.
Okay, good morning. I'm Rowena Kalu. I'm from the University of Trinidad and Tobago, so I'm from Trinidad in the Caribbean. And I work, of course, in the Faculty of Education in two areas, student-centered pedagogy and science education. And this theme attracted me to the conference because my PhD work was an ethnographic study of teacher-pupil relationships within primary classrooms. And what came out to me so clearly was how irrelevant your work as a researcher could be. Because, it was a very humbling experience. Because in the school I went to, of course, Trinidad is a very small island, 1.3 million people. There were ex-students of mine who had done wonderful work in their practicum, who had, just reverted back to practices I never thought they would use. The teachers I looked at had developed their own philosophies and ways of thinking about the world and coping in the classroom, and what was interesting was that they could speak the language of education and the things that they learned, but they practiced what helped them to survive. And what was a bit alarming to me was that practice could go against the needs of the children. But it was actually more complex than that, and you'd have to understand a little bit about the Trinidad education system to see that interaction. So I became, and actually I've always been, because of my work in teacher education, very concerned about that washout effect. I mean, why are we working so hard in the universities and colleges when teachers have concerns which are so immediate? And how do we bridge that gap? So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Sharon Fraser Burgess. I am at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. And what I find intriguing about the theme is just the unknowns. Well, we say to know is not enough. Well, I want to ask, well, enough for what? For practice, it's not enough to, there are also some sort of normative questions, I think, that arise. Are we talking about epistemological norms? Are we talking about moral norms? I think what's really, as I said, intriguing is just the questions around what the theme is prompting us to explore, and what our way of answering these questions says about us, about our assumptions, about our what's non-controversial, what we want to accept, what we don't want to accept. So I think it's a great theme for this point in teacher education, because I think it's going to force us to talk about what our non-negotiables are morally, epistemologically, and in terms of practice.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to offer their thoughts before we turn to the essayists? Yes, please introduce yourself.
I'm Beth Salyers. I have the privilege of being a new teacher support coach at UNC Charlotte, and we go into the bottom 5% performing schools in North Carolina, and currently I work in several schools in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. And my school loans are coming due soon, so I wasn't even sure if I was going to be able to afford to come all the way out here for a conference this year, but the theme is what made me work some ways here and there, because I'm going to assume that we're all privileged in this room to be able to read and write and do research. But when I go into schools, that's when kind of it hits the pavement. And you work with middle school students who are homeless, and you work with middle school students, elementary school students who read on a pre-K or fourth grade level. And so that's why I'm here, because I know we can all read and write and we enjoy that process, but I'm here because when we go into schools and we meet the students and the teachers, I think that the ability to develop their agency within their context is key.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for your comments. What I'd like to do now is to turn to the essayists. As we proceed through the session this morning, if you have specific questions about specific essays, please have those ready, because we will have some time to engage the authors in that way as well. Ken Zeichner, would you like to begin talking a little bit in response and some of the ideas that you put in your essay?
All right. I'm not going to talk about the essay. It's on the website, but I want to frame it a little bit. Essentially, I see what's the theme and the role of scholars in relationship to the theme. As I say, us engaged in a political struggle for the soul of education and the survival of education as a public good, pure and simple political struggle. Being a teacher educator, I've been a university teacher educator for some 35 years or so. Teacher education is under assault on a daily basis. Andy Hargraves and Michael Saylor have recently described it as a clash between professional and business cultures. So there's a clash going on right now for control of public education. And clearly, the system is not working for many families across the world. The usual process of being a scholar, whether you're based in a think tank or a university, is you do research. It's vetted through a peer review process, and through that process, the truth emerges and continues to reemerge as it evolves. That's all gone now in terms of the debates around my field, teacher education. Research is ignored and distorted. Policies are promoted, such as privatization of public schooling and now teacher education, and accountability processes such as value added, where there's really no evidence that these processes actually accomplish what they were intended to do, and they're not new. They're not new. But the people coming in now, the so-called new educational entrepreneurs, think they're new because they don't bother to study and try to learn anything from the past. So we have a situation where it's difficult even to engage in sort of a conversation that we've been used to engaging in within the academic world. Things have been framed in a particular way. The problem is public schools, teachers, and university ed schools. And the solution is privatization and punitive forms of accountability. And so you're either a defender, and that's someone like me, even though I've been a critic of university teacher education for my entire career. I'm classified as a defender because I don't want to tear down the system and replace it with something else, and that is a reformer. So in one sense, my essay is about a different approach, which is to transform the system, not to throw it away, but to try to rebuild it based on learning from the past. University teacher education, being a university teacher educator today, we've lost funding where most of the teachers have been prepared in public institutions, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. And new regimes of accountability are coming in, and the corporate media has just reinforced the framing that exists. So my essay is essentially about the question of reform or transform. And so I look at the arguments for reforming, tearing down, the system has failed, we need to replace it with something else, versus transforming. And I argue that this whole idea of narrowing the teacher's role and privatizing and narrowing the role to teacher as an implementer of scripts of teaching. And I also point out what is not talked about a lot in these public debates is that these teachers who are to implement scripts are only to do it for some people's children. And so we have this increased emphasis on teachers as technicians as opposed to teaching as a career, teaching as something that is thoughtful, intellectual, where the teacher is able to exercise her judgment in the classroom. But we have this divide. We have the people advocating these policies of privatization and deprofessionalization, continuing to send their own children to schools where they're taught by professional teachers, whether they're private schools or the public schools that are more advantaged. And we have a growing inequality. And so the difficult thing about it, and I've yet to grapple with it, including in the essay, is the way in which the argument for reform is articulated is wrapped in a language of progressivism. I just started teaching, our spring quarter just started a few weeks ago. In the first session of my class, I played the welcoming speech by Secretary of Education Arne Duncan to the Second International Summit on Teaching in New York City, where it sounded wonderful if you didn't know what was actually being implemented specifically in terms of the policy. So it's a very complex and tricky thing in terms of really trying to see as to the role of the scholar. One is to try to articulate very clearly, without jargon, what the position is for transformation. And so although I published a paper, I think in 2010, on the neoliberal assault on teacher education in the United States, I've not published anything since then that's used the word neoliberal. And some would argue with that, but I'm trying to communicate to a broader audience. The second is to go into the public sphere and engage with people who see themselves as reformers and try to talk to them, as difficult as it may be, and as hard as we can, to try to find some common ground where we can move forward in the interests of the kids and the families who are not being served by public education. And the third thing that I'm personally trying to do, my current work, is focusing on trying to help illuminate the full extent of what's going on. And so some of my current research is focusing on the role, the invisible role of think tanks and other groups, venture philanthropists, in orchestrating educational policy in the United States with regard to teacher education, in framing the media and the way in which they report on issues of teacher quality and teacher education to get the information out there. I was really inspired by my former dean, Julie Underwood at Wisconsin, who just recently published an article in Kaplan, clear, short, talking about the role of the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, in developing educational bills, promoting charter schools, deprofessionalizing teaching, and privatizing teacher education. Let's get the information up to the surface when we have this conversation and not pretend, and to try to find some common ground, as hard as it may be, to move forward, because I think that's the bottom line moving forward. But it's not an academic game, it's a power struggle for the soul of education.
Thank you. Thank you. Sausan, Erife.
Ken's a hard act to follow, especially because the words that he is speaking are so true and so, very dire. I am here to kind of change the subject, just completely change the subject. I am here as a Hampshire graduate, an alumna of Hampshire College. And how many people here know of Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts? Okay, not too many. It's one of a consortium of 5 colleges: Hampshire College, Amherst College, Mount Holyoke College, Smith College, and then the University of Massachusetts. And Hampshire College is an alternative, experimenting institution that was established in the early 1970s. And it doesn't have grades, and it doesn't have a course progression as we know it. It is very much based on inquiry learning. Students themselves identify and propose projects, identify mentors to guide them, and they go through a course of study that can take place in many different ways, not always through coursework, but evidence of their excellence is shown through final demonstrated projects. Coming out of that system as an undergrad, I went to the University of British Columbia, so I was educated here for my master's. I went to the University of Wisconsin, Research 1, I was educated there. I was a research analyst at the American Institutes for Research, and that's one of the think tanks that Ken is talking about. And now I'm a professor at Southern Connecticut State University in New Haven, in Connecticut, where we have the largest achievement gap in the nation, and New Haven is one of the poorest cities in the whole United States. So I have a big view, I think, on what's going on in a certain way. And what I want to say about non satis is that, of course, I perked up when I saw that as the theme, because I thought, why is AERA looking to Hampshire College for guidance about doing research in education? And I thought, as I've done more research, I was struck by my own cultural frame in looking at that. Non satis in fact, I think comes from Goethe, the idea that to know is not enough, we must do. To will is not enough, we must act. But Hampshire College had its own framing of non satis and as I looked into the history and my own sort of implicit understanding, I thought about this theme, and I identified that I think the president and program chair were focusing on the output proposition of the theme. And as Sharon said, really my interest is all about the values of what we're talking about, the epistemological underpinnings, the philosophical underpinnings, the ontological underpinnings of what it is that we are thinking about when we're thinking about what is education, what are we doing when we do education, why are we doing it, what's the point. So I thought, AERA is focusing on this output proposition that when we create knowledge, we have to create it to do good, and this is something that I truly believe in and we should do. Hampshire College, though, and it's also a researcher's perspective. Hampshire College, though, in terms of my implicit understanding, kind of focuses on the input propositions. And the 2 things that I focused on in the essay that are really very near and dear in my heart and, part of who I am. The first is that you have to draw on your own experience, that you should draw on that. And this is something I think that we very much forget when we're in our schools, with our students, from our own communities, places far away, communities that are different from ours, cultural frames that are different than ours. We don't value them. We don't value their knowledge. We don't understand their perspective. It's one example is I work with an African man who speaks 6 languages and has incredible accolades in his country, and he comes to the U.S. and he is undervalued. And I sit in my class and I watch my students treat him terribly because they don't understand or know how to understand who he is. And I don't think I do either, right? I use that as just one example, and this happens in many different ways. The other proposition, so we have to value our experience, we have to value our knowledge, and we also have to value other people's knowledges from other places, non-sanctioned knowledge, non-institutional knowledge. And I think that our reliance on research, on the one hand, and our creation of research is very important. But on the other hand, we should be really opening the way that we look at the world, the way that we understand the world, and who, of course, we allow into the conversation to talk about and help us understand the world, or follow them in their understandings. I'd like to speak just a little bit about grades, to say that I have never understood grades. I really don't know what purpose they serve, and I don't know why it's important for me to say, Ken, that you are an A student and you are a B student. I don't understand the rationale. My experience is that narrative feedback, the communicational exchange and process between two people, a teacher and a student, and we know that teachers teach students, and we know that students teach teachers. That is a process that I think is most important, and that we're missing altogether somehow right now. So I'm having a little trouble with grades and wondering how we might get beyond grades or do something different. And then the other thing is I think the methodological stringency that we have come into in the past decade or so, where we have, in the accountability era, and we really can't look at our world holistically. We can't look at our systems holistically. Everybody is dancing to a certain tune. It very much has to do with the kind of policy framings and funding streams that Ken is addressing in terms of teacher education, but in all of the different ways that we do education. And so that's another piece as well. In my paper, I say at the end, there are a couple of blue sky things. I mean, what if we were to do away with seat time? What if we were actually to progress? And we're beginning to do these things, and so I'm very happy to see that. Or beginning to think to do these things. But what if we moved away from moving kids along by age as opposed to their ability? And certainly social grouping is important for social reasons, but not necessarily for academic. What if we truly use technology? What if we let kids use their cell phones? What if we did all of these different things that I think would really facilitate a much better world? And so I think that's where I come to regarding non satis scira. Really, I think at the moment I'm a Hampshire College graduate who never was truly taught how to fit into the structures of the world, and so I guess as a result I've tended to not understand them and disrupt them a little bit, and I encourage you all to take risks and disrupt them some more.
Nicholas.
Okay, yes. So I'd like to share, our essay was co-written, so Robin Paulson, are you here? Okay, So our essay is a little different because Ken's and your last essay were individually written. So our essay formulated from the perspective of current graduate students, soon-to-be professors. And so we're on the side of students still about to cross over, right? And so we really contextualized our essay in terms of the work that the Graduate Student Council for AERA is doing currently and has done historically. And so we talk about the project with Habitat for Humanity we did in New Orleans. And so it's a new tradition that the grad students will do a service project, correct? So when we're in San Francisco, we'll do some type of project. And so when the commissioned essays, when Arinitha approached us to write an essay, we really thought about the question of how do we know we're actually doing good? And what is common? Who is common? Because traditionally we know what the Academy has stood for, who is embodied in the professoriate, who it teaches, right? And so as doctoral students, we understand that to land a position, right, we need to publish. The whole idea of publish or perish. But it's interesting, Howard Zinn, in writings on disobedience and democracy, he writes, academics publish while others perish. And so to go back to the beginning when Rick introduced, had people respond, I heard from the three women three things. I heard relevancy, reality, and for whom, right? Because the reality, we write about education, but what's going on in the schoolhouse, right? So with that in mind, our essay was titled Justice-Oriented Service, Why the Academy Must Serve in Order to Lead. And so it's really based in the work of Westheimer and Kahn and democratic citizenship. But again, demos, people. Who are the people we're talking about? We often study down oppressed groups. We never study the privileged. One, because they won't give us access and entry, right? I mean, that's the first research course grad students take, access and entry. But with that in mind, we really talk about where the Academy is going. And it's going in a good place, we think. We're optimistic. And what we use for evidence is the Carnegie classifications. So we often emphasize publishing, very high research activity, R1 status, grant securement, funds, endowments, accolades. But the community engaged institution distinction, that is something that only 40 in 2011 very high research activity institutions had on top of that. So community engagement, right? So then another question we have, are we as the Academy interested in communities more of a predatory sense? You know, we're going to use your community for the research we need to publish so we get promoted and so we get a big name and we become an academic rock star. Or are we going to listen to you, learn from you, share the resources we have, and in concert with you, help in whatever form that may take? And so this year, we partnered with the same project, Surrey Appreciates Me, and we created a mural with secondary students. And it was interesting because the whole project started with the students' voices. They said, look, I'm getting bullied at school. I'm having trouble, being teased. I have identity issues. My house is not stable. What can I do? And we listened to them. They created the panels, and then graduate students worked alongside them. And so essentially what I want to share with you today in my short period of time, to honor everyone's time, I know Rick had plans to engage the audience, is this idea of how do we know that we're doing good? Who are we helping? Who are we serving? And such. And so I guess as a doctoral student, soon to be a professor who has a position lined up, right? I often question my own work. Why am I doing this? Why did I write this essay? It's funny, right? Because we're talking about social justice, we're talking about non-statistician in a written form, right? And so I guess for me, as an Asian American, as a current graduate student soon to graduate, as the chair of the Graduate Student Council, there's always these questions of unknowns, uncertainty, ambivalence, insecurity, vulnerability. But then how I deal with that is serving and just listening. So as a leader, I say, okay, what do you think we should do? You know, we talk about things. Oh, that's a great idea. Okay. And so kind of piggybacking off your ideas of like breaking away from tradition. Why do we do grades? Like what, visionary? What's the point of grades? What's the point of service? And so I think we need to start emphasizing service as much as we emphasize research and teaching. And so those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Responses? Questions?
Actually, the woman in purple here had something that she was going to say.
Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Yvonne Berkman, weird name. My husband is German, so Von Berkman is not my last name. I started my K-16 education in Taiwan. Coming to U.S., I got my graduate degree in Los Angeles. I stayed in the U.S. for 10 years, and I worked on third international math and science studies for 6 years. And I moved on to Calgary as a science teacher educator. Right now, I'm in UBC. I teach dentists how to teach, help them how to conduct educational research. So I've been in my position for 16 months. My perspective is also quite wide in a way to make this following comment. My understanding about your final point on relevancy and reality issues. When I was a school coach in South Central Los Angeles, there are lots of information that I gathered from the teacher, from the principals, and I kept wondering what's the relevancies of the theories that we learn in School of Education. When I went on to TIMSS, I thought a lot of what we have found in TIMSS study, 48 countries comparative studies, is really profound. It enlightened me about how system impact on the theoretical framework or practices. But nowhere I would imagine how people interpret or misinterpret the kind of policy suggestions that we have. When I moved on to science teacher educations, I found myself constantly trying to defend some of those policy suggestions that we have. I don't think that we intend to bash teachers' role, and in essence, that experience, the knowledge that I gained from TIMSS actually helped me to understand how difficult it is to understand teacher preparation programs. And from serving all these Canadian teacher preparation programs, it also helped me to understand how difficult it is to really address the accountability issues. And yet, even though it's difficult, as a former physicist, I also like to say it's somehow improbable but not impossible. It's a matter of how you looked at it, how you come close to it, and try to look at it from both macro and micro perspective. That's just the thought that I have.
Thank you. Any comments? Other questions?
So this is going to be a little jumbled because I'm kind of intellectually provoked. So
Good.
I was a high school English teacher in the 90s. By the way, I'm Jason Margolis from Duquesne University right now. I was a high school English teacher in the 90s before I crossed over, as you put it. And that experience, for those 6 years teaching high school in New York, most certainly drove my questions, passions, and interests for years, and still does in many ways. But I'm wrestling with Ken Zeichner's concept of reforming versus transforming teacher education. And personally, I still struggle with how long can I be asking the right questions and using the right methods as I drift further and further away from the 90s. And I wonder, as I look around with the people I've worked with at the various institutions I've worked with, how long they can remain relevant as well. And some of them have never even had teaching experience. So I wonder if that relevancy, realistic connection can be held without reforming. Because if you just try and transform, my fear is that people on the other side are too comfortable. And they're not really going to change.
Can I begin to respond to that? Reform has been defined in a particular way. Blow up and replace with something else, a privatized system. And so transformation to me is pretty radical. And although I don't articulate it in the essay, in other work that I'm doing, I'm trying to articulate a form of teacher education that changes power relations very drastically. And that universities, if they are to remain involved in teacher education, need to share responsibility and recognize expertise that exists outside of the academy in ways that have never been done before, not only in the teaching force in the public schools, but also in the communities where people live and send their kids to public schools. So there's I don't know that transformation, to me transformation is radical, and the reason I'm using something other than reform is that reform has been framed in a way which is literally blow up and replace. And that the educational entrepreneur, people who come in with no experience and no knowledge of history, come in and create something out of nothing. Just the way people went in and created Google and Microsoft and this idea that you get a bunch of smart people and they're going to create it and run it, and in no way does that model of reform that's being articulated today recognize the expertise within schools and communities in the ways that I think we have to do if we're going to become relevant to the needs of the communities that we're supposedly serving.
Do you think that there's a willingness to transform in those people who you think, who you're speaking of? I mean, I know you've worked in several institutions as well. The people you know, the people you've met, the majority of them, are they willing to transform?
I don't see an overwhelming positive response to what I'm saying. I see a lot of things are fine, why are they picking on us kind of response. People are under attack and become defensive. And doing the kinds of things I'm envisioning involve giving up some of our control and sharing responsibility in genuine ways, and maybe not doing, it certainly means not doing things in the way we've been doing them. And so far, my sense is the reaction to what I'm working on is that's too far out there and nobody's going to, and so I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know unless we do that, unless we give up the power in the way that I'm arguing, that we're going to be gone. In ed schools, university teacher education is going to be gone unless it changes in those ways and forms alliances with people already in local communities working on the problems that we're working in within the sphere of education. So it's a process of aligning with things already going on, with the teachers in the schools working against the grain and trying to serve the needs of all students in schools. And so there may not be a lot of support for it now, but the consequences will be drastic if universities don't move in that direction.
One final radical thought here. We all may need to go back to the classroom part-time.
There.
Okay. We have another question here. I just wanted to make an observation and ask you to consider. Every few years, when I come to AERA, I feel a slight shift. It's not 180 degrees, it's not 90 degrees, it's not 30 degrees, but there's a little shift every now and again. I wonder if I'm sensing it or if I'm just hoping to sense it. I wonder if there are enough people in the educational research community who are starting to sense that we cannot do business as usual anymore. That the education academy has to change. I'm just wondering about that. Question here, and then I'll be over there.
Thank you, and good morning. My name is Ann Enderberg. I'm in my 4th year as an assistant professor at Eastern Connecticut State University. And as the second speaker mentioned, we have the largest achievement gap in the country. And for the previous 30 years, I was a bilingual teacher and administrator in the Wyndham Public Schools, which has the largest achievement gap in the state of Connecticut. And it was part of my frustration when I was working there that I could not hire the teachers that I needed to work with the children that I had had for many years myself and knew full well were capable of success. Mm-hmm. So what you're describing about needing to go back to the classroom, I agree with. What you're talking about as transformation feels radical to the academy is very obvious. But we will lose the whole game if we don't change. And I'm appalled by my colleagues' lack of sense of urgency and just complete disconnect with the students that we're serving. But I just really wanted to thank Nick. Oh, I have your last name right in front of me. It just gave me great hope to hear you saying what you're saying as a young professional entering the field, to have the commitment to service, to ask about what resources, genuine resources, universities can provide to communities, not as a predatory approach, but as a genuine service approach in a humble and respectful way. It gives me a lot of hope. And to hear you say that you're optimistic along with your colleagues, I wish you well and I welcome you to the group.
Thank you.
Comments? We have another question.
Good morning. Maria Teresa Tato from Michigan State University. I want to encourage all of you to come and listen to a talk we're giving at a panel at 2 p.m. today. The panel is about quite an unprecedented effort. And I think it answers some of these questions essential to this conference. The panel is about how a group of teacher educators from 17 different countries got together to study their own programs with very rigorous research methods. And so my question, as we are discussing these very important issues this morning, is who should be in charge of this transformation? And I do feel very concerned that, as Ken is saying, a lot of people who don't know much about teacher education, they don't know much about teaching, and they don't know much about children, are attempting to change or introduce change through methods and strategies that have not been proven to have an effect. So the study that we did is a study where people engage in developing assessments of knowledge of mathematics for teacher education, and we try to measure, or we measure, how teacher education impacts mathematics knowledge for teaching as people are ready to go into the classroom. This is an example of how teacher educators studying their own systems can change. And as we were doing the study, which by the way we started in 2008, 2009, we saw transformation of teacher education programs as we were doing the study. So I think we can do this transformation, but I think we need, as teacher educators, to take charge of our own research and producing our own knowledge, and then changing based on what we know, changing as we learn, as we move along in learning from our own practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments?
my perspective is, again, if we over-rely on research in the way that we've traditionally done research, the golden rule doesn't stand for treat others how you want to be treated. It stands for whoever has the gold makes the rules. And that's where neoliberal reform comes in. So they're co-opting it, they're using money, and they have a lot of power, economic power. And so when you apply for grants, who are the funding institutions? What are the stipulations in that grant? What are the contractual obligations? Which communities are served? Who has the power and authority to say what gets done? And so to answer that question, shared governance is nice. When it's grassroots, it's nice. When it's community-based, it's nice. But, right, who are the stakeholders and what amount of voice are they given? And so historically we know that. But moving to the future, we can continue down that path or we can transform it. And hopefully we do. Otherwise we're going to get the same result, right? Doing the same thing, hoping for different results, that's just insanity, right? I think Einstein said that. So hopefully we try new innovative approaches so we'll get better outcomes.
Thank you. Another question?
My name is Fatih Zargami, and I teach in St. Cloud State University in the state of Minnesota. And, you know, when you come to ARA, when you want to ask a question, your thought is just all over, so I try to kind of condense. So I have one question and one kind of reflection. My question is, in this transformation or reform that you are talking about, we are talking about many different sides. And one side is student. I want to know how can we get along and kind of push our students to really go through this direction that, you know, some of us who are thinking a little bit out of box, you know, can take this with us. Because, like in my case, in all my courses, I don't have any tests that they have to memorize or anything like that. Most of them are reflection and, you know, based off the, you know, their journal or their thought. So there's two difficulties with this. First, students think that then we don't need to study. If you just want to know, you know, what we think, so we just write what we think. And so that's what, you know, when you're talking about the grade, these two comes to the picture, you know. It's much easier for them to tell them that go and memorize the first 10 pages of phone book rather than telling them that, okay, what did you understand from this 5 minutes, you know, video? So this is the things that we have to think about that. If you want to change that, we have to teach them also, because for them, students still grade is an important thing for them. We have to be very creative, make sure that yes, they are learning, whatever we define the learning, and they make sure that, oh, I worked so hard, because I get a complaint from students that in all my courses I'm getting A, why in this course I'm not getting A? And I can memorize the book, and you don't want us, you know, just try it, you know, I'm perfect on that. But this is the piece that we have to work. And this is my question, how? And my reflection is, honest with you, you know, sometimes we tell our students that we don't have a stupid question, ask whatever you have in your mind, but sometimes we personally get stuck on that, you know. Past, at least I can say 12 years, this is my question. When I get in an airplane and I'm going back to my place, and I'm like, okay, again, 15,000 of us got together in some place, and we talked about all the issues, and we identified even more issues, but we have no solution. Honest with you, I want to think about coming to ARA. I said, I have to have a solution for the problem. How about if you say, okay, let's next year identify a solution, and all those papers going to be based on that. Identifying a solution and identify issue, finding the solution, and test it in your organization, whatever. Bring the result, so at least we can come and say, okay, this 10 ways is not working, rather than identifying issues every year. And I just get you know, I see all the good points, but I see sometimes on that empty half also 20,000 or 15,000 people, you know, top notch from wherever they are, why we have the same issue, why achievement gap is supposed to be the topic of every year. Thank you.
I'd like to respond, and thank you for that question. First of all, in terms of the grades and the expectations of your students, I think that we are so conditioned about grades, and that we cannot imagine a world without them. We don't know who we are. I teach in a doctoral program. I have doctoral students. I tell them, you are becoming experts. I am not teaching you. You're not at school anymore. We are in dialogue, etc., and they cannot get their heads around it. And I spend huge amounts of time at the beginning of the semester. I mean, I'm now starting to set some time aside to, explain to them over and over again why I am not interested in their grade, and I'm not going to give them a grade in the way that they anticipate. And what is an answer about that is, and a problem about it, and about not giving grades and feeding back from a narrative perspective, is that we as educators have to be committed to the individual interactions that we have with each one of those students to explain to them, no, we're not doing just journal writing. We are getting you to engage with a topic. I want to know what you really think about it. I'm going to watch and work with you to develop mastery by doing it over and over and over again with you. And teachers are not up for that in many cases. They're tired, they want to go home, and so grades in some cases, and not in all cases, are very convenient and efficient, and I think that's what they were developed for in our industrial notion of education. Sadly, I think an answer has to do with each of us as educators making a moral commitment to communicate with our students about what our expectations are, and to really be clear in communicating with them about what they need to do to move from A to B, because for some reason when we give them an A, they feel that they've moved from A to B, but they don't have any understanding of what that is, and they maybe have not moved at all. So that's one piece. I don't know if that's satisfying. The other piece about how we come together, and we don't do very much. I would like to talk about sort of this nested ecological notion of systems, that we are individual people, we are people in relation to one another in dyads, triads, bigger groups. Then we form social and cultural organizations. We form economic and political organizations. And there are all of these layers and strata that we have to negotiate every day, daily. And it's unclear, I think, oftentimes to us, and very implicit in the way that we think, where our commitments truly lie. So you talk a lot about, where is my commitment as a burgeoning academic? Am I going to publish? What does all of this research have to do when the rubber meets the road, et cetera? And so I think there's a lot about that we have to understand about what are the different frames that we operate in, and how do we understand them? And as academics, as researchers, as people with certain commitments in our own personal lives, which ones are we going to prioritize? I think that when you are in your classroom as a teacher, or when you are in the field as a researcher, and you're doing something and you say to yourself, and I know we've all had the voice inside us, this is not working, or this does not make sense. That's a place where I think that's a place of activism where we have to step forward, I think, and try and understand ways that we could actually make sense. And I know it's all very unformed, and I don't have a silver bullet to tell you, the 10 things we should do, because it can't be. It's very situational. It's highly situational. And this transformative process, I guess, is going to be messy and muddy. And I just wonder about, how do we change? Well, we change in these many different frames. And, that's enough.
I'd like for us to come back to this issue of context in just a moment. We have another question here.
Hi, I'm Kristin Wren from Michigan State University, and I don't work in teacher preparation. I work in higher education, so I come from a slightly different perspective, so I apologize for things I don't know there. So I have a question that kind of ties some of these together, which is that thinking about the issue of the so-called educational entrepreneurs, one of their big ideas is getting away from seat time, moving to competency-based, both for youth and for people who are educating them, which I think ties nicely to sort of Susan's advocacy for that, but it's also been sort of seized on by some of the larger foundations. MacArthur Foundation, a colleague of mine talks about the movement towards what he calls digital deschooling. And actually, Nick, this connects to, I don't share your optimism for the future of higher education and the future of the academy. I think it'll be fine while I'm still working, but I think during your career, you're likely to see some substantial changes. And they're not going to be changes in the direction about which you are optimistic. The digital deschooling movement has reached certainly to higher education as well, and it connects also to sort of, why do we have teacher prep programs? Can't we just, send the manager of the Piggly Wiggly in to run that school? There's certainly a lot of connections there. I'd like to hear you talk to each other, sort of challenging this issue of competency-based learning and how that connects to some of the so-called educational entrepreneurs.
So we're going to talk to each other.
Competency-based learning, in my context, teacher preparation has meant a dumbing down of teaching for other people's children. The teachers who teach other people's children, people who are trained in sort of a skill-based approach, like Lemav's 49 strategies for teaching like a champion, as an example, that are common sense things, but that's the basis of the preparation in a number of cases, rather than social foundations, teachers being able to situate their work in the social and political context in which they're working, and knowing about the communities that they're working in and the histories of those communities. That stuff is wiped out. So it has had a negative effect, I think, in the way that it's being played out by those who are funding it. And we need to talk about what's happening to the public university, where most teachers are educated, at least in the United States, in terms of the... I came to Seattle in 2009. Since 2009, 50% of the state support for the University of Washington disappeared, and we're right, down the street is the Gates Foundation, and the increased role of those on the outside of the institution in determining what goes on in the institution. So it's not something we can sit down and deliberate about and come to a solution. There's a takeover of public, almost everything, including the public universities that many of us work in. And so I sometimes when I'm critical of the competency-based focus in teacher education, and this is not something new. I was a big part of the debate in 1970s and 1980s when competency-based teacher education in an earlier form was there. It's something that has existed for 100 years in teacher education. That does not, I'm not articulating a position against technical competence, and that's how people try to position me as that. And so I think teachers need a broad education. Teaching should be viewed upon as a profession, as a career, and as intellectual work, and you can teach competencies within that context. But the way it's being played out now leaves no room for that, and it's just competence. And Doug Lemav's 49 teaching strategies is seen as something that we should all aspire toward as the basis for our work in teacher education. So I don't.
So my background is elementary teacher, but my doctoral studies are foundations. So I would respond, and I'm a very honest person if you know me. So when Ken was talking about in the 70s, I'm like, I wasn't born then, right? Right, so I can read all about this, right? So here's an example of lived experience, right? So expertise, how do we frame expertise, right? Critical knowledge, that's the anti-status quo. Community knowledge, right? The indigenous insider knowledge. And classical knowledge, the canon, history, right? And so I would respond, I am optimistic because people are starting to get disgruntled. The forces, economic forces, Wall Street. And so I understand the neoliberal, Philip Kovacs's book on the Gates Foundation is a wonderful analysis of the problem that's going on. The one thing I've learned as a doctoral student that I need is Freire and Macedo's idea of reading the word and the world. As a person who's literate, I'm critical. My literacy transcends just reading documentation. I read what is going on in the streets with the common people. And so we have a lot of things on our favor. We have numbers. We have a critical mass of people. And so once consciousness is, you reach consciousness, I am optimistic. And so our essay was framed from the academy's point of view, not in the schoolhouse. What does the academy do? Because it tends to be, right, I took a course with Gloria Latson-Billy and said we produce knowledge, right? And then the policymakers take this knowledge, and they might use it right, they won't use it right. But what does the academy do? So if we don't change, like Ken said, others have said, we might not have colleges of education in a few years, right? Teach for America will take over, all of these other neoliberal, for-profit online schools, right? And we know what they are used for, what their purpose, their function, right? And it's to stratify society, just like education has always been used. You know, my PhD from my institution doesn't equate to a PhD. I know that. Well, I'll take my show where it's valued. So I think that in response to this dialogue, I think we have to really question expertise. What does that mean? Who is an expert? Is it communal knowledge? Can you read about being a teacher and never have taught, right? So you have situations where professors have very limited experience teaching or no experience. Is that problematic?
So I'm trying to figure out how to insert here. And I think what I want to do is not necessarily argue my perspective, but to argue a perspective just for the heck of it. So, you know, we talk about power and we talk about this entrepreneurial moment. And I think many colleges of education, because we're not at the table, we're saying, wait a minute, we're not at the table. And so we are balking at the power dynamic that's going on. My question, so people, entities have been dissatisfied with us, and maybe we've not been as responsive as we might have been, or we could have been. Maybe we're seeing things differently now. Maybe there are turnover in personnel. But there are certainly things that we in higher ed, in schools and colleges of education, that we could probably do better and should do better, and so that's fine. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be at the table. And then the other side is that these entrepreneurial organizations, there are certainly aspects to them that are interesting, innovative, provocative, useful, I think, and good. And so what I'd like to suggest is, how can we not throw babies out with bathwater? How can we draw upon the very important institutional knowledge and experience that we have had in institutions of higher education, in education schools, in our faculty, in our students as they've emerged in the world, but at the same time realize that we are in a very different, is it a postmodern world? It's the post-Fordist world. We're in a different space, and so we do need some different responses. I think when I think about reform versus transform, and I do think reform has been co-opted. We can't use reform. Transform I agree with, but it's one of those things like my transform looks different from your transform. So what does transform really?
That needs to be worked out in a
right.
space, I'm arguing, that
right.
includes not just us, but people in schools and people in communities.
But that's right. And so what I am glad to hear is about a dialogue. Now, competency-based, that's a whole other piece. What are the competencies? What do we feel is competent? What are truly the outputs that we want? I'm not that interested in assessment outputs. I'm not, what I want to see is I want to see students who are happy, cared for, safe. I want teachers who are compassionate and supportive. I want to see people enter into the world of play and the world of work, capable and able to speak their mind without fear and to do things that are different. So those are my competencies. I think that's it.
Thank you. I have a question back here. A couple of others.
Hello, I'm Barbara Elvacrog. I teach at a small liberal arts college in Minnesota, Hamline University. I teach in a graduate program there, a graduate school, a doctoral program. We have master's programs. We have a variety of innovative programs. I think part of the reason for that is for many years we did not have a tenure system. We were all very committed teachers. All of us have had classroom experience, but a tenure system was required of us, and we created one using Ernest Boyer's Characteristics of Scholarship, if you have heard of that one. It includes service and engagement and teaching as scholarship in addition to writing. So my question is, how do you see the role of tenure in a higher ed institution, the transformation of tenure possibly, as part of this larger transformation?
I'm all for it.
For tenure?
Yes, out of both sides of my mouth. I'm for it, and I'm for its transformation.
Yeah, I mean, I've been at my first ARA was 1977 in New York City, and I've been going ever since, except for 1 year when I was on sabbatical in Australia, and it was too far to come back. But have a perspective on this. There's always been this argument for changing the rules within the academy to values engagement, community engagement, service. There's a different dynamic going on now, again, looking at public universities, where I've spent my career, Wisconsin and Washington, and the way in which the defunding of those institutions, the increased influence of outside money and outside forces. It's not something that's necessarily under our control within the academy to make these rules when we're spending most of our time talking about, how are we going to deal with, 50% of the budget disappearing in 3 years. It puts us in a defensive mode, trying to survive, and people are getting laid off. And losing their jobs, and people who are in staffing positions are given more work with no more money. And I mean, it's a crisis in public education, not just education schools. So it's nice to sit around and talk about how the rules for what we value in education schools might be different, and I think we need to continue to do that. But it's really at a state of crisis that I don't know that within the academy alone, we can work this out without some sort of new alliance beyond the academy, or alliances beyond the academy, because the public university is being destroyed.
I want to respond about the rules. I think so much of it is about practice. And what is it that we spend our time doing? Are we doing service? Are we engaged? Are we doing what it is important to do? Or are we working to maintain the institutions and these institutional ways of doing and thinking that we have, that have come down to us? I'm a new academic. I'm on year 2. And this business, I've put in my second year renewal file. This business of putting together a tenure file, the amount of time that it takes, the shards of paper and things that you have to find, the way, what's very positive about it is an annual reflection, and I actually perceive that as it's almost a spiritual moment, right? I'm reflecting on my life, I'm reflecting on my worth and good as a person and as someone who's contributing to the world, and I feel that way, but at the same time, I don't think that I am spending more time than most people putting together my file, but the amount of energy it takes just to do this one thing in relation to tenure, I think is not right, because I think it's a perpetuation of an institutional form. So I'm not arguing against tenure right now. I'm arguing against the practice of how it comes to pass. And I think I think we need to trouble and question some of those things. And as well, in terms of what you're talking about, what are the rules? What are we actually doing? What are we engaged in? What's the basis of our work? And like you say, the surface learning. Where are our engagements? So.
Well, as someone that's been on the market and and giving job talks, getting talk through the tenure and promotion process. To me, I don't think tenure is the problem and the panacea is getting rid of it or keeping it. I openly support tenure for the same reasons I support K-12 teachers not having to perform, performance-based evaluations, And so how would professors respond if, we don't have tenure, and you only keep your job if your graduate students all say they love you, or, something to that effect. And so I think the larger question that hasn't been asked is, what happens if your moral, spiritual, educative commitments are in opposition to that tenure process? And so, we value research, and institutions vary by institution. So you might go to an institution where editing a book is service. Well, I don't conceptualize that as service, really. It's a form of service, but my type of service is serving others, in the community, in the lay, not in the academia. So it is interesting, and you'll be sanctioned for it. So you come up and you don't do it, then you're out of a job. So I think the tenure question, I'm in support of it, and I understand it's stressful to get it, but if you don't get it, then maybe that's not a place where they value your work. Maybe you should take your show somewhere else. So
let me ask one piece. Right.
Yeah.
And if I could just add one more thing too, I don't know whether I'm against tenure because I haven't managed to figure out the other side, which is that once someone has tenure, there are those of us who work in departments where people have tenure and they're not really contributing very much. They're not contributing much to the institution. They're not contributing much to the community. And so if the tenure space is a safeguard for their non-contribution, then I wonder about that. But as we know right now in the world of teacher education and teachers, that's a terrible, it's a very difficult row to hoe. So I don't know.
And in that argument, I understand there's the two perspectives. The free rider, once they get it, they're just going to be lazy. But every tenured professor that I know, and maybe, I socialize with all the crazy ones at AERA, but they all work their tails off. And you hear these, I'm retired. Yeah, right, you're not retired. You're doing more work than you've ever done, right? And so, but yeah, you're right. It's two sides of it.
I have a few friends on the other side.
I support tenure. So that we're able to say what we need to say and not lose our jobs. So this kind of conversation, if there wasn't tenure, some people would be in trouble in some institutions. And so I think it's important, but we need to look at the criteria and so on. But I was arguing it's becoming increasingly difficult to sort of realize this sort of alternative view of tenure based on engagement and service and so on, given the reality of universities becoming businesses. We just adopted a new budgeting model where we're talking about, how many credits each faculty member needs to produce. And it's all in terms of revenue streams coming in because the public streams have gone away. Mm-hmm. And so it's a different context in which we're operating now than in the past.
Yes.
We're about 10 minutes away from our finish time, so I want to take a couple of other questions but conserve just a couple of minutes in case the essayist would like to make any summary statements.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristin Wren. I am a recently graduated master's student, so recently mastered, student at University of British Columbia here in Vancouver. And that was part of the organizing team for the community service project with the AERA Graduate Student Council. It was a project that we started thinking about it a year ago, right after the meeting at New Orleans. And we started working with the students about 8 months ago. So part of the questions that we've had since the beginning is, how do we fit the AERA delegates that are going to come for the one day and work with the students who have been part of this project for a much longer time. And as we were working with the students on Thursday, and we could see the magic of the connections happening between secondary students and and graduate students or superintendents or whoever joined the project for that day. I was wondering, so who is doing the service to whom? Like, who's serving whom, right? We're talking about academics serving the community. And what I saw on Thursday, those secondary students were giving service to the academics who came to this research conference and were so happy to have a couple hours to be working with the real person, the real student. What are your concerns? What are you passionate about? Or you want to paint a line here? Amazing. So I wanted to raise this reflection. I wouldn't want to see academics feeling that they have to do that, or they want to do service because they're up here and community is down here, and because we know all this as academics, then we're serving others. I think I'm challenging that idea a little bit. Practice has so much service to provide to academia, and we have to start talking about it that way as well. I don't know if anyone has.
Well, I wrote down a note. It's what you just said, Christine, and thank you. She did a lot of heavy lifting in this project, and it goes back to my previous statement. I've written about what I call teacher pet projects and social justice. So we call it social justice, but what it is a status for the teacher, and it doesn't have the voice of the students. And a good example is Mr. Greg Mortensen. If you've read John Krakauer's book about Pennies for Peace and 3 Cups of Tea, right? It's a personal enrichment program. And so that's where this neoliberal comes in, and these corporations and foundations of, oh, we will give you these monies and we're saving these disadvantaged children, or we're serving them. But to answer your question, it has to be what you said, symbiotic. It's a two-way. You learn from the students are learning from you, rather than parasitic top-down. We're going to extract resources from you. But we're giving resources, supposedly, but we're extracting resources in the name of service. And it doesn't pass the litmus test. It smells funny, then it is funny. So.
Another direction. I thank you for raising that comment, because every time I hear the word service, I hear hierarchy and going out and serving people, and I'm envisioning something where we're serving each other. When I was involved in the governing council of ARA a number of years ago in Division K, one of the things I tried to do was to develop greater connections with teachers, not to serve teachers, but to have their voices heard within the context of AERA, because at least in the United States, when you say AERA, most teachers don't even know what you mean. It's not part of their daily lives. And I think another direction, and I think the direction you're talking about with the understanding that the way you're framing it is important, is who it is in AERA, who attends AERA. And I remember for a number of years there was this group called the Coalition for Education Activists, and I went to a number of the meetings, and I remember having a proposal accepted, and they said, well, because I don't know if they only sent it to academics, but you will be at a conference with parents and legislators and teachers, and it was sort of scolding the academic to make sure that you address the broad audience that would be there rather than the typical academic conference. So I really think that the whole constitution of who is at AERA needs to change. There are lots of teachers around the world who do research, and most of them are not at AERA. There's a small teacher researcher SIG that exists here, and the times that I've gone to it, and I'm going to it again tonight, it's mostly the few K-12 teachers who are here. And there's this sort of lack of opportunity for the voices and the perspectives of others outside of the official academy to be in dialogue with us within the very meetings that we have, that I think is a direction that we need to pursue, in addition to this idea of connecting to the community, building awareness, connecting to the communities that we are meeting in. Because that's a new development, and I think it's a good development. I remember back in 1981, being in Los Angeles, meeting at a hotel and across the street in a park were all these homeless people sleeping on, this was back in 1981. It's fairly common now, given the state of the economy, but back in 1981 it was less common. And here are all these people pulling up in limos going into AERA in this fancy hotel, and these people are out there sleeping on the ground. And there was just nothing at all within the AERA that really acknowledged that, let alone trying to do anything. So I think this development that the graduate students are leading is a good one, but I think we need to change the constitution of AERA in terms of who it is that's in the dialogue within these meetings.
I have a thought as well, which is that a couple things. One, our structure, you talk about how engaged the students were, how excited they were, I'm sure, to be a host here for the folks from AERA and to work with them. Our structures in school don't often allow us, or our students, to have those experiences. We require them to sit in classrooms. We feel it's unsafe for them to engage with the community. It can be, but it's not always. And, I am a huge advocate of authentic learning in community spaces, truly collaborating, collaborating together side by side, shoulder by shoulder, in ways where we can, interact with one another that is not hierarchical. So I am always very pleased to hear when there are those kinds of projects, because I think it's so important for students to get out and feel worthwhile in the world, a real world that's not their school world that they perceive as being something other. And then in terms of service, I don't know. I suppose it all depends on how we define service within ourselves. I would argue, in terms of my own personal definition, service is not service if I'm getting something back from it, if I am to benefit from it, per se. And if I'm going in thinking, I'm going to do this service because it will be beneficial for me, then that's, I would not say, a true kind of service. So perhaps we all need to think about, really, why are we doing what we're doing when we do service work, and what are those relations.
Nicholas, do you have any thoughts?
It was lovely. I agree. I think the way you just said it, if you're getting something from it. But then, as Christine said, that we are getting something like that humanizing spirit, but tangible,
Right.
Yeah,
not profit or gain.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderfully said.
Thank you.
We have come to the end of the time. I want to say thank you to our essayists, Ken Zeichner, Sausen Arafay,
Thank you to
Nicholas
everybody.
Hartlap. I also want to say thank you to those of you who contributed to the conversation, to those of you who were engaged in the conversation. As I said at the beginning, this is an experiment. And if you have some thoughts about how well it worked, or how well it didn't work, or how it could work better, I would invite you to go back to the AERA website, click on the commissioned essays, the themed essays, and you will see an email address to the organization where you can respond to the essays that our colleagues here have written and some other colleagues have written, but you can also make comments about this particular session. I felt that we got warmed up a little bit. We got going a little bit later in the session. I want to thank you for your time and your energy here this morning and contributing to the dialogue. Thanks very much. Have a good meeting.